This series of videos addresses the biology of depression. This particular video, which is the first, approaches some definitions of depression that were given throughout history, from ancient Greece to the 1940s. This is a very vast theme which include the areas of genetics, epigenetics and molecular biology, biochemistry, metabolism and body physiology, neurobiology, and even socio-demographic factors. These areas will progressively be approached in this series. Also, because the main focus is biology, psychological perspectives will tend to be left aside. The information presented in these videos is based in different references. You can check the sources of information in the description of the video, just need to look at the number inside the square brackets. In ancient Greece, and about until the 18th century, the humor theory was the main body of explanation of disease and even personality. Disease was somehow a consequence of an imbalance in the four basic body fluids. Hippocrates has used the concept of melancholy to name what we call today as depression. People suffering from this disease were supposed to have too much black bile in their bodies. Hippocrates and other ancient physicians described melancholy as being associated with mental and physical symptoms, including persistent fears and despondencies, poor appetite, abulia, sleeplessness, irritability, agitation and lasting a long time. In ancient Rome, Galen added fixed delusions to the set of symptoms listed by Hippocrates. Galen also believed that melancholia caused cancer. Until the 16th century, Hippocrates and Galen theories were regarded as medical orthodoxy. If we look at the four humors associations on the graph of the left, we can see with which characteristics each humor was associated: a personality, a body fluid, a planet, a season, a body organ, a period of life, a natural element and temperature or moist status. For instance, the melancholic personality is associated with black bile, spleen, winter, Saturn, earth, old age and cold and dry. As such, it is understandable that a treatment for this disease might include moist and hot environments to help this dry and cold people. Behind this, there seems to be a belief that melancholy and emotional states are physically determined by all these factors. The figure on the right is from the 18th century and depicts the four humors or personalities. In Middle Ages Europe, the religious perspective gained a strong importance. Depressive moods had been designated by the Pope Gregory I as a vice, tristia, acedia, sloth. Acedia, from the Greek, meaning lack of care, depicted a variety of psychological states: laziness, apathy, ennui, or boredom. In the late 4th century, Evagrius of Pontus characterizes acedia as the most troublesome of all of the 8 genera of evil thoughts. The Benedictine rule directed that a monk reproved acedia and punished these individuals if they did not amended their behavior so that the others would fear. Unresolved acedia had also been associated with demonic possession. The figure on the left is a depiction called acedia, made by Hieronymus Wierix in the 16th century. The figure on the right represents the noonday demon, thought to be active at the noon hour to incline its victims to acedia. So, although the humor theory remained medical orthodoxy, this new religious element had been somehow added to the way of perceiving melancholy. Other important mark in the history of medicine from medieval times is Ibn Sina, AVICENNA. Ibn Sina, who was born in the past Persia, today's Uzbekistan, wrote the Canon of Medicine, an encyclopedia of reference in the history of medicine. His perspective on the biological basis of psychiatric disorders is also based upon the teachings of four body fluids from humor theory. Ibn Sina says, melancholia is a disarray of thoughts that gravitate towards a disorder and a feeling of fear. Disease primarily manifests as sudden outbursts of anger, a tendency toward solitude, and fear of things that one usually shouldn't be afraid of. When disease settles in, these symptoms become stronger. A man disposed to this disease is one with a warm heart, an abundance of hair on his chest, and the body, one with a lot of humidity in the brain and with fat lips. This disease is most often seen in men, but is heavier in nature in women. For the treatment of melancholia, Ibn Sina proposes changes in sleep, diet, physical activity, music therapy, aromatherapy, massages, changes in the communication with the social environment, herb medication, and others. In his change of diet, he defends eating foods with high energy content, sweet and fatty foods to supply humidity to this dry individuals. As you can understand, this type of explanations for psychiatric disorders based on the four humor theories is also present in Ibn Sina's thought. Even so, I don't think the thought of this medical references of antiquity and medieval times shall be reduced to the humor theory. For instance, the reading of an article called Ibn Sina as a Psychiatrist makes me understand that he advocated the use of the scientific method, made a systematic classification of diseases and classified new ones, invented new techniques such as the administration of remedies through injection needles, and was the first to use anesthesia during surgical procedures, differentiated between body and mind and recognized the interrelation between psychological and physical phenomena. Maybe, because knowledge was not as advanced as today, certain phenomena were still not understandable from the point of view we have today. For instance, an herb effect might be explained by the four humor theory instead of a biochemical mechanism. It worked, but people couldn't understand why. A last example of the way of thinking about melancholy, or about other health issue, in Middle Ages is the case of Hildegard of Bingen. There, we find a combination of the Catholic way of thinking with the four humor theory. For instance, she says,
mankind lives out of the four elements. Namely, God has put the world together out of these four elements. Or Adam, who was created out of the earth, was awakened with the elements and thereby transformed.
In the table on the right we can see an example of the typification Hildegard of Bingen made of people, according to the four humor theory. Although her ideas are non-scientific, many of them are still interesting to read, and so I will quote her on melancholic people. She defined melancholic men as follows.
Melancholic men really love no one, rather they are embittered, suspicious, resentful, dissolute in their passion, and as unregulated in their interaction with women as a donkey. If they satisfy their desire for women, they suffer no spiritual sickness. However, their cohabitation with women which they should maintain in a proper way, is difficult, contradictory, and as deadly as with vicious wolves. Some of them traffic enthusiastically in the male way with women, however, afterwards they hate these women. Others can avoid the female gender because they do not care for women and do not wish to have them, but in their hearts they are as wild as lions and conduct themselves like bears. The influence of the devil rages so powerfully in the passion of these men that they would kill the woman with whom they are having sexual relations if they could. For there is nothing of love of affection in them. The wind in their genitals has three characteristic features. For one, it is fiery, then also windy and finally intermixed with the smoke of the black bile. Therefore, they are incapable of having a genuine loving relationship with any being. Through that they become bitter, avaricious, and full of foolishness and abundant passion. In intercourse with women they know no moderation and act like donkeys. If they were permitted, these men would kill a woman during their intercourse, for there is nothing of the tenderness of loving desire nor of sincerity in their embrace. Melancholic women are more healthy, more powerful, and happier without a mate than with one because they become with from relations with a husband. However, men avoid them because they do not speak in a friendly manner to men and because men love them only a little.
This description gave us an example of how the humor theory can be put together with the reading of personality types. Whether we believe in this humor theory or not, many characteristics of melancholic people, as seen by Hildegard of Bingen, were described. For me, the most prominent characteristic she identified in melancholic men, not women, was a strong instability of personality and, as consequence, not being a trustworthy person. In early modern history, Catholic influence was still present in most of European countries. The misunderstanding and persecution of disturbed people was a fact of life in 16th century Europe, and many of those disturbed people were hunted down as witches. Johann Weyer was the first physician to specialize in mental illness, or melancholies as it was then termed. Although Weyer's writing indicate he believed in demons, as Pseudomonarchia Daemonum indicates, he fought the practice of punishing or killing suspected witches, contending that these melancholics were not demonic but mentally ill, as defended in Cade Prestigius Daemonum. During the modern era, other of the most influential works on the matter of melancholia has been a book published by Robert Burton, The Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621. This book was mainly developed in a scholastic manner, drawing knowledge from nearly every science of his time. Burton defined this subject as is either in disposition or in habit. In disposition is that transitory melancholy which goes and comes upon every small occasion of sorrow, need, sickness, trouble, fear, grief, passion, or perturbation of the mind, any manner of care, discontent, or thought which causes anguish, dullness, heaviness, and vexation of spirit, that is dull, sad, sour, lumpish, ill-disposed, solitary, any way moved, or displeased. And from these melancholy dispositions no man living is free, no stoic, none so wise, none so happy, none so patient. This melancholy of which we are to treat is a habit, a serious ailment, a settled humour, as Aurelianus and others call it, not errant, but fixed, and as it was long increasing, so, now being, pleasant or painful, grown to a habit, it will hardly be removed. Burton suggested that melancholy could be treated or eased with an healthy diet, sufficient sleep, meaningful work, talking about the problem with a friend, and with music and dance. On the right we find the allegorical frontispiece to the 1628 third edition of Anatomy of Melancholy, engraved by Christian Leblon. In his satirical preface to the reader, Burton's persona and pseudonym Democritus Jr. explains, "I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy." We can see there were considered subtypes or variations in melancholia. Hypochondriacus, maniacus, solitudo, and others. Also, at this time, melancholic mood was also many times associated with a mark of genius and with increased artistic and intellectual sensitivity, as Aristotle associated as well. Melancholia has been a theme in many artistic, intellectual and cultural movements, namely in England's cultural movements, William Shakespeare, William Blake, Edward Young or John Downland. During the 18th century, the humour theory of melancholia was increasingly being challenged by mechanical and electrical explanations. Humour theory was still an important influence, but knowledge paradigms seemed to be in a phase of transition to modern science. For instance, Herman Boerhaave is a case of withdrawal from a vitalist way of understanding the disease. You can imagine Hippocrates talking about phleuma and fire. Now we were moving to a perspective closer to chemistry and mechanics influenced by authors as Descartes or Newton. The physiology of veins, for example, Boerhaave compared to the operation of pipes, with explanations based on hydraulic principles. Transition to modern science was on its way. As we move to contemporary history, theories and problems raised have more meaning to us. Here, we will look at some of the first contemporary approaches to depression. An early use of the word depression in psychiatry has been made in 1856 by the psychiatrist Louis de Lejeune. By the 1860s it was appearing in medical dictionaries to refer to a physiological and metaphorical lowering of emotional function. With the usage of both words in medical treatises, depression and melancholia had become synonyms by the end of the 19th century. In the history of depression, 3 of the most cited references of the early 20th century include Emil Kraepelin, Sigmund Freud, and Adolf Meyer. We will now focus on their perspectives and main contributions to the understanding of depression. H. de J. Eyson's Encyclopedia of Psychology identifies Kraepelin as the founder of modern scientific psychiatry, psychopharmacology, and psychiatric genetics. Emil Kraepelin developed a new psychiatric nosology in his textbook Psychiatry. Ein Lehrbuch für Studierende und Ärzte, 8 editions between 1883 and 1915. Although I haven't read too much about Kraepelin, I find its nosology its main contribution to psychiatry and the understanding of depression. Nosology is about the method of classifying diseases. The principles of Kraepelin nosology include scientific naturalism, scientific progress, and having an hierarchy of validators. 1. Scientific naturalism states that psychiatric phenomena are natural phenomena to be studied with the methods from natural sciences. It is based on the idea that after a construction process of conjecture and refutation, progress would lead to the definition of the natural disease units, in other words, clearly defined and isolated diseases. Some authors criticize this idea of a perfectly isolated disease type, mostly in psychiatry. For instance, Alfred Hoche rejected the idea of pure or isolated syndromes. Eric Engstrom and Matthias Weber believed that Kraepelin's nosology would create preconceived categories that would somehow narrow the interpretation. Karl Jaspers, also recognizing the limitations of Kraepelin's nosology, accepted the idea of trying to create a more objective frame of orientation. 2. The second principle, scientific progress, is based on the idea that, through history, many phenomena that were not understood were, after some time, understood. New disease mechanisms, for instance, serological mechanisms, might give a more simple and precise answer to a disorder that was in the past very confusing to understand. Even if Kraepelin's perspective looks very mechanistic, he didn't neglect the psychological and psychophysical phenomena once they were studied in a scientific way. He was influenced from Wilhelm Wundt. 3. The third principle, the hierarchy of validators, comes from the difficulty, higher in psychiatry, to classify a person's problem as being part of this or that typified disorder. In psychiatry, biological indicators or markers are harder to find. Also, Kraepelin didn't believe mental states could be reduced to neural states. For even further complexification of this problem of classification, Kraepelin said that one of the cardinal principles of his method was the recognition that any given symptom may appear in many disorders. For instance, there is almost no single symptom occurring in dementia praecox which cannot be found, sometimes, in manic depression, disorders he created in his classification system. What distinguishes each disease symptomatically is not any particular symptom or symptoms, but a specific pattern of symptoms. That's why there is need for a hierarchization of the importance of the factors that determine the disease should exist. Kraepelin established that cause and outcome of the disorder were the primary validators of psychiatric disorders. Just to finish, there seems to be a certain biologism and authoritarianism in Emil Kraepelin's thought. For instance, he relates his concepts of moral insanity, lack of strength against impulses, born criminal ideas, homosexuality, eccentrics, liars, to mood disturbances. He talks about and is favorable to eugenics and racial hygiene. He talks about a deterioration of the gene pool. He talks as if almost every discriminated or different social group was like disturbed. From this, he sounds very inhumane. For me, his main contribution to psychiatry was his nosology, his try to make psychiatry a science. Freud didn't use the natural sciences method to understand the phenomena he studied, mostly deep psychic phenomena. His perspective seems more humanistic than mechanistic. He tries to unveil the intricate conscious and unconscious psychic dynamics that lead to psychic disturbances. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud argues that mourning and melancholia are similar but different responses to loss. In mourning, a person deals with the grief of losing a specific love object, and this process takes place in the conscious mind. In melancholia, a person grieves for a loss they are unable to fully comprehend or identify, and thus this process takes place in the unconscious mind. Mourning is considered a healthy and natural process of grieving a loss, while melancholia is considered pathological. Freud identifies three preconditions of melancholia: loss of the object, ambivalence, and regression of libido into the ego. To see an example of Freud's reasoning intricacy, here's his reconstruction of the melancholic process in Mourning and Melancholia. An object choice, an attachment of the libido to a particular person, had one time existed, then, owing to a real slight or disappointment coming from this loved person, the object relationship was shattered. The result was not the normal one of a withdrawal of the libido from this object and a displacement of it to a new one, but something different. The free libido was withdrawn into the ego. There served to establish an identification of the ego with the abandoned object. Thus the shadow of the object fell upon the ego, and the latter could henceforth be judged by a special agency, as thought it were an object, the forsaken object. In this way an object loss was transformed into an ego loss. There is a narcissistic blow to the ego related with a rejection or object loss. In internal conflict, the ego doesn't want to accept this loss and initiates an anticathexis movement. By taking flight to the ego, love escapes extinction. The ego may love and hate the lost object, may fantasize making it suffer, or may imagine ways in which he is superior to it. There is like an internal fight to protect the ego from a defeat. The ego is compromised, self-perception gets worse. Also, the outside world impression gets more negative and threatening. This struggle, happening mostly in the unconscious mind, shall get clearer only after the regression of the libido. This perspective clearly focused the cause of melancholy or depression in psychic phenomena. I would say in simplification that the cause of depression taken from Freud's perspective would be a strong ego defeat, so strong people wouldn't want to look at it. When Meyer referred to Sigmund Freud and his contributions to psychoanalytic theory, therefore, he found him valuable for broadening and humanizing the concept of mind, but deficient in contributions to a social formulation of life. Adolf Meyer, a Swiss psychiatrist who became the highly influential head of the Henry Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University, viewed all psychiatric disorders as reaction types, or psychobiological reactions of the organism to stress. Social, psychological and biological factors had to be considered. As such, many professions would have to cooperate to the medical research, being biology the base. He was inspired by Charles Darwin, William James, Charles Peirce, John Dewey, and G. Stanley Hall. Still believing that biology was the health science base, and Adolf Meyer's strong contribution to psychiatry was recognizing the importance that social context has to the health of a person. It might not be enough to understand some physiological mechanisms of disease or to bring to conscience unconscious conflicts. The social context may give meaning to life, may create a more or less stressing environment, and so on. To understand the importance Adolf Meyer gave to this psychosocial factor, I will refer various examples. 1. He believed that a new social environment coming from industrialization and urbanization reduced the opportunities for self-fulfillment and creativity in individual enterprise and increased the chance of meaningless machine operation. 2. He believed play and industry developed feelings of success and accomplishment. 3. Schools ought to be included in health programs, and so, teachers should be also concerned with the life story of the child. 4. Meyer formulated the possibility of the presence of psychiatrists in mental hygiene districts to serve as catalysts of friendship and cooperation. 5. Meyer believed state institutions should be brought to help the welfare of community. So, Adolf Meyer was a case of psychiatrist that has brought this social, context, development factors to the analysis of psychiatric issues. The next video will cover the development of the concept of depression in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and on the International Classification of Diseases books. I hope to see you there.